My name is Rachel Evans, 26 years old, a broke hotel waitress trying to raise a little boy on my own. And the night everything changed began with me spilling a tray of champagne in front of people who barely noticed I existed. The ballroom at Harbor Bay was a world soaked in gold, light, and soft music, a place where every surface sparkled as if it belonged to people who never had to worry about rent or overdue medical bills. I moved between tables with numb feet, feeling small in a room full of diamonds that cost more than my entire life. The air carried the mix of perfume, candle smoke, and that faint metallic scent from silver trays that never stayed empty for long, while my cheap shoes pressed blisters into my heels. I kept reminding myself that I needed the extra shift because my son's therapist raised the fee again, but the reminder only made my chest feel tighter. No one looked at me unless they needed something, and even then their eyes slid past me like I was part of the furniture. As I refilled another row of champagne flutes, I noticed a boy sitting alone at the far end of the table, gently aligning the fork and knife over and over as if the world made more sense when everything stayed perfectly straight. His shoulders curled inward the way my son's did when he felt overwhelmed. And something in me recognized the silent panic behind his steady movements. People walked past him without a second glance, laughing about auctions and private schools as if the child who sat right there meant nothing. While I collected empty glasses, I overheard a group of guests talk about the boy in a low, careless tone, saying he was odd, spoiled, and better kept out of sight so he would not ruin the photographs. Their words landed like cold needles under my skin, sharp enough to drown out the music and the clinking glasses. I felt a familiar heat rise in my throat, the same mix of anger and heartbreak I carried every time someone looked at my son like he was a problem instead of a person. I set the tray down and wiped my hands, trying to steady the tremor that always came when I was about to do something brave or foolish. Then I took a breath, stepped away from the safety of the server's lane, and walked toward the boy who everyone else pretended not to see. Mika stayed exactly where I had seen him last, his small shoulders tight as he kept adjusting the fork and knife in a slow, careful rhythm that seemed to calm him. I watched the room swirl past him in bright gowns and polished shoes, and for a moment he looked so much like my daughter when she tried to make sense of a loud world that did not bend for her. The memory pushed me forward before I could talk myself out of it. I walked to his table with my heart tapping fast against my ribs, aware that a waitress had no real place interrupting the guests, but something about his stillness made that rule feel small. I knelt beside him and told him my name, keeping my voice soft the way I did with my own child on rough days. When he looked up, his eyes held a logic that tried to measure me, as if he needed to understand every possible outcome before he chose to trust me. The orchestra shifted into a slow waltz that the host had announced as a family moment, and the change tightened the air around us. I asked him if he wanted to try the dance with me, not as a show for anyone, but simply because no one should sit alone while the music asked for a hand to hold. He hesitated, fingers tapping the table in a steady rhythm, then gave the smallest nod as if the decision cost him something real. I helped him stand, and together we moved to the edge of the dance floor where the lights softened into a warm haze. I placed his hand in mine and counted quietly so he could follow the pattern. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, until his feet began to trust the space between each beat. His shoulders loosened, and a faint, careful smile lifted the corner of his mouth like sunlight breaking through a thin cloud. The room began to quiet in a way that felt unnatural, as if the music had dropped beneath the weight of 1,000 eyes. I felt Mika lean closer, not frightened but aware that something had shifted. When I lifted my gaze, I saw a man standing near the center of the ballroom, with a presence sharp enough to cut through the silence, and his eyes were locked on us with a fierce intensity that made my breath catch. Nico Voss reached us with a quiet force that made the space around him feel colder, and Mika's hand tightened around mine as if he sensed the shift. I kept my posture steady even while my stomach pulled tight, because every story I had ever heard about this man painted him as someone who could break a life with a single look, yet he did not seem angry. He studied me as if trying to understand why a woman like me had stepped into a world that had nothing to do with her. He asked why I thought I had the right to take his son onto the floor, and the question felt both sharp and honest. I told him the truth, that I saw a boy overwhelmed by the noise and the lights, and that guiding him through a pattern he could predict might help him breathe. Something in his expression shifted, not softer but clearer, as if no one had spoken of Mika that way in a very long time. Nico glanced at his son, then back at me, and the silence stretched until I felt it slide beneath my skin. He motioned toward his table and said I should sit with them for a moment, and the sound of chairs freezing mid-scrape across the ballroom told me the entire room had heard him. I followed only because Mika walked with me, his small hand trusting mine in a way that left no room to step back. When Nico pulled out a chair for me, the gesture felt strange, almost tender, but wrapped in a weight that carried danger and gratitude in the same breath. He said people never knew what to do with Mika, that they saw difficulty instead of depth, and that he had stopped expecting kindness from strangers. His voice carried a tired truth that pressed into me, a truth that only a parent who had watched the world push their child aside could say without breaking. I told him I did not see something broken in his son. I only saw a child trying to understand a world that demanded too much from him at once, and sometimes all a child needs is someone willing to slow down long enough to meet him where he is. The words left my mouth before I could soften them, and for a moment Nico stared at me as if I had said something dangerous and beautiful at the same time. One of his guards stepped closer and leaned toward me with a calm, controlled voice, asking for my contact information so they could reach me later. My pulse jumped hard, and I gripped the edge of the chair because I could not tell if this was an invitation or the beginning of a mistake I would never walk away from. Morning always came too fast in my small apartment, slipping through the thin curtains before I was ready to face another day. Lily sat at the kitchen counter swinging her feet while I packed her lunch, and the sound of her quiet humming made the cramped space feel brighter even though the overdue bills spread across the table said otherwise. I kissed her forehead, told her to be brave at school, and tried not to let her see how hard it was to stretch one paycheck across a life that kept demanding more. The diner where I worked barely woke up at sunrise, but the smell of burnt coffee and fried batter settled into my uniform before the first customer walked in. I wiped down the counter and reminded myself that this was the real world, not the glowing ballroom where I had hovered beside people who lived in a place I would never belong. The memory felt distant and strange, as if it belonged to someone luckier or more foolish than me. I was pouring a refill for a truck driver when the door opened, and a man in a dark suit stepped inside with a presence that froze the room. He introduced himself as Adrian, and placed a sealed envelope on the counter with a kind of careful respect that did not match the rough edges of the diner. Inside was a handwritten letter from Nico, and a check with more zeros than anything I had ever held, along with a request that I meet him at his estate. My hands shook as I read it again, hoping the numbers had changed into something less unreal. My chest tightened with fear because people like Nico did not reach out unless they wanted something, and I was terrified of what that might be. But the rent was late. Lily needed new shoes, and kindness from a man like him felt almost as dangerous as his anger. I stepped outside during my break and called my mother, telling her only that someone wealthy offered help after seeing me at an event. She warned me to stay careful, and reminded me that nothing came free, but I could not bring myself to explain who he really was. The truth felt too heavy to say out loud. Back inside the restroom, I splashed water on my face and looked at my reflection under the harsh fluorescent light. I saw a tired woman in a wrinkled uniform trying to hold her life together, and I wondered if walking into that mansion meant stepping toward hope or into something that could swallow me whole. The drive to the estate felt longer than it should have, maybe because every mile pushed me farther from the life I understood. The mansion sat on the edge of the bay like something carved from stone and silence, more fortress than home, with tall windows that reflected the gray water below. Adrian met me at the gate and escorted me through halls lined with cold marble and soft lights that never seemed warm enough to soften the sharp edges of the place. He led me into a wide library where the scent of old paper mixed with salt from the sea, and Nico waited beside a long table with his hands clasped as if he had been holding a thought for too long. I placed the envelope in front of him and told him I could not accept money I did not earn, but he only nodded as if the gesture mattered less than the reason behind it. His attention drifted toward the window before he said that people often misunderstood Mika because they looked at what confused them instead of what made him brave. He spoke about how the boy hated crowds and bright rooms, how he clung to patterns when life felt too loud, and how most adults treated him as a problem to hide. There was something raw in the way he said his wife had been the only person who understood their son without expecting him to change, and that since losing her he had been trying to hold the world still for Mika, even when it refused to listen. His voice stayed steady, but each word carried a weight that showed how deeply he feared failing the child they had loved together. Then he looked at me with a focus that made the room feel smaller, and asked if I would spend a few afternoons each week with Mika to help him feel less alone. The offer came with a salary that could give Lily a stable life and enough room for me to breathe for the first time in years, and he said I could bring her so she would not need another sitter. His concern for safety was almost obsessive, as if every step he took had been shaped by the fear of losing the only family he had left. I felt torn between the warning in my gut and the promise of something better than survival. Standing in that cold, beautiful room, I realized he was offering me more than a job. He was offering me a place in a world that frightened me, a world that might change everything if I was brave enough to accept it. Nico walked with a slower pace as we moved deeper into the mansion, as if the quiet part of the house required a different kind of respect. He stopped before a pale wooden door and let me enter first, and the moment I stepped inside, I felt the shift in the air. Mika's room did not match the cold halls outside. It felt like a small universe built around logic, calm, and the kind of order that made life gentle for a child who needed the world to stay steady. Shelves lined the walls with books arranged by color and subject, and each spine looked touched but not worn. A model of the solar system rotated softly under a dim lamp, creating slow circles of light across the ceiling. Stacks of science cards lay on the desk in perfect grids, and I understood immediately how much comfort he found in the shapes and patterns he controlled. Mika greeted me with a quick glance and a small tilt of his head, then showed me the book he was reading about stars collapsing into new forms. His hands moved with certainty as he explained how planets followed rules even when everything else grew chaotic, and I felt the soft tug of admiration because he carried more knowledge in his small frame than most adults I had met. He offered me a seat beside him with the quiet expectation that I would respect the order of his world. After a moment, he crossed the room and opened a drawer with a careful grip, then brought out a small wooden box shaped like a seashell. He placed it in my hands and waited for me to open it, and when I turned the key, a gentle melody drifted through the room with a softness that felt almost like breath. He said he remembered his mother holding it near his ear when he could not sleep, and that sometimes he kept it closed because the memory made his chest feel tight. The truth in his voice pressed into me, and I saw the weight carried by both father and son, a grief that shaped everything around them. I told him the melody was beautiful, and he watched me as if searching for something he needed to believe. Then he asked if Lily and I would come back, and the small hopeful lift in his voice settled deep in my heart, making it impossible to imagine walking away from him. 3 weeks passed in a rhythm I never expected, shaped by quiet afternoons at the estate where Lily and Mika found a way to meet each other in the middle of their very different worlds. Lily brought her crayons and impulsive joy, while Mika offered the calm certainty of structure, and somehow their energies blended into something soft and steady. They spent hours building little universes out of cardboard planets and paper stars, placing each world in the order Mika chose, while Lily added colors that made him smile without hesitation. I watched them from the doorway as sunlight washed over their projects, and I saw how Mika's shoulders loosened when Lily laughed. He began to speak more freely, offering her facts about space or explaining why he liked the quiet corners of the room, and she listened with the kind of patience that came from growing up alongside a mother who knew how to move gently through tender places. Their friendship grew without effort, as if the two of them had simply been waiting for someone who understood their version of the world. Nico often stood in the background, not close enough to intrude but always near enough to protect. His eyes followed Mika with a steady focus that carried both love and a fear I recognized from my own nights awake worrying about Lily. Sometimes he would glance at me across the room as if checking whether I saw the same fragile hope he did, and in those moments our silence felt like a bridge rather than a wall. There were small moments that stayed with me, like the afternoon I found Mika letting Lily place stickers on his notebooks even though they disrupted his perfect order, or the evening Nico handed me a cup of tea without a word, watching the children from the balcony with a quiet longing that softened the hard lines of his face. I realized then that our lives had begun to overlap in ways none of us had planned, weaving comfort into a place that had only known shadows. Despite the warmth, a faint unease lingered under the peace, a feeling that the walls around the estate held stories I was not meant to know. Still, each time I watched Lily and Mika build their little solar systems, I felt something inside me settle. We were creating a world of our own, fragile and bright, even as something unnamed waited beyond the quiet. The first sign that something had shifted came when I noticed 2 unfamiliar guards posted near the gates, and another by the side garden where the children liked to play. Their presence carried attention that did not belong to the quiet afternoons we had grown used to, and I felt a sharp tug of dread settle in my stomach. Even the air seemed heavier, as if the estate had pulled its walls tighter around us. Nico found me in the hallway and asked me to walk with him to the terrace where the view of the bay stretched wide and gray. He stood with his hands resting on the railing before he said there had been a new threat, something he did not want near Mika or anyone connected to him. His voice stayed calm, but I heard the strain underneath, a tone that spoke of danger pressing closer than he wanted to admit. When he said he would assign protection for me and Lily, the words struck like a cold slap. I told him I did not want my daughter growing up next to armed men or learning to be careful of shadows, and the fear in my chest pushed my voice louder than I meant. He tried to explain that it was temporary and necessary, but all I could see were the risks spilling into the fragile space we had built. Our argument rose and fell in tight, unsteady waves as I told him I could not let Lily become part of a world shaped by threats. He stepped closer and said he feared losing Mika every day, and that the thought of losing us too had begun to feel unbearable. The admission caught me off guard because it was not wrapped in power or control. It was a simple truth from a man who carried more fear than he ever showed. I took a breath that felt too thin, and told him I would accept protection only if I kept my say in how it touched our lives. He agreed without hesitation, as if the condition was nothing compared to the relief of knowing we were willing to stay. The fight left a strange quiet behind, a mix of anger, tenderness, and something that felt almost like commitment. As the wind from the bay brushed against us, I realized that somewhere in the weeks between chaos and calm, we had formed a shape that looked frighteningly close to a family. The danger had not vanished, but the bond tying the four of us together felt stronger than the fear trying to break it. Mika's birthday came on a quiet afternoon when the garden room smelled faintly of lemon trees and the soft sugar of a small homemade cake. There were no crowds or flashing lights, just Lily helping him place tiny paper planets on a string while he explained how gravity worked in his steady, careful voice. Their laughter rose and fell like a gentle rhythm, and for the first time I saw Mika move without the weight of the world pressing on his shoulders. Nico watched from the corner of the room, leaning against the doorframe as if afraid that stepping closer might break the fragile peace in front of him. The tension that usually shaped his posture had softened into something warm and almost unfamiliar, and I realized he was seeing a version of his son he had spent years praying for. When he looked at me, his eyes held a quiet gratitude that said he understood exactly how far Mika had come. Later, he asked me to step outside with him where the light from the garden filtered through the windows and wrapped the hallway in gold. He spoke about the danger that still circled his life and the limits of what he could change, then offered me two paths with a calm sincerity that surprised me. One path meant leaving with lifelong protection and enough support to build a new future far from his world, and the other meant staying as part of the family Mika had built around us piece by piece. I felt the weight of the choice settle in my chest because both options carried love and fear in equal measure. I thought about Lily's growing confidence, about the way she held Mika's hand during new tasks, and about the rare, gentle smile that crossed Nico's face when he watched them. There was a truth in those moments that felt deeper than safety, and I understood that what tied us together was no longer a job or an accident, but something shaped by care and quiet understanding. I told him I would stay, not because I was unafraid, but because this strange little circle of people had become a place where I felt seen in a way I never expected. He nodded with a softness I had never witnessed in him, and the silence between us felt like an agreement neither of us needed to name. As I watched the children finish their project of tiny planets, I realized the heart of this story had never been about danger or power. It had been about learning to see the people the world often overlooked, and about choosing to live rather than simply survive.